Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is RJ, and today I'll be demonstrating amplitude modulation for E314 at Cal Poly with instructor Steve Denton. Now I'll go ahead and share my screen first. Okay, so here I'm looking at the Canvas page, and under week 4, I've posted this demonstrations and exercises for E314. That's a PDF, and I've also uploaded this am.m, which is the example script that I'll be using. So once you open up that PDF, this is what it looks like. And then we can go ahead and go to the first section, which is just amplitude modulation so far. And let's break down this assignment. So kick things off with the quote, AM, which is the abbreviation for amplitude modulation. So AM is the 5th studio album by English rock band Arctic Monkeys, according to Wikipedia. And I think this is a good quote because amplitude modulation is pretty much an umbrella term, right? So there's a lot of different types of AM, and it depends on how we define our modulation scheme. So there's what we call strictly AM. There is double sideband, suppressed carrier, so the type of amplitude modulation. There's also single sideband, quadrature amplitude modulation, and the list pretty much goes on and on. So for this exercise, or for the demonstration first, I'm going to be considering just strictly AM, as I mentioned down there. But the purpose of this exercise is to perform various amplitude modulation techniques. So we're going to have you go ahead and look at another technique later on, but let's look at the demonstration first. So AM is often used for radio broadcasting. So we're going to pretend to be a broadcast station. And during lecture, we mentioned that the highest range that humans can hear is 20 kilohertz. And the audible range is roughly between 20 and 20 kilohertz. So AM broadcast stations are typically assigned, or are in fact assigned 10 kilohertz on 10 kilohertz intervals between 540 and 1600 kilohertz. Just kind of for your information. So before we can broadcast, we need to consider the modulation type, modulation index, carrier frequency, and the message signal. So let's start off with modulation type. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at strictly AM, and this is not the Arctic Monkeys album. So first we're going to look at the strictly AM signal, which is denoted by this V sub AM of t. And you'll notice it has two time varying signals. It has your amplitude of the carrier times the cosine, or we like to say modulated by a cosine. And you've also got your message signal modulated by a cosine. So you'll notice that this AC, A sub C cosine of omega CT, this is a single tone signal, right? It's only got a single frequency. So if we look at the two-sided frequency spectrum of this signal, you've got an impulse at the carrier frequencies, right? So there are two impulses there. And then this is actually going to be at a height of pi times A sub C. If you look at your Fourier transform table, do note that we're in the angular frequency domain, not regular frequency, because those actually differ. So then if we look at the message signal, let's say we have some arbitrary message signal, right? It's just some kind of music or something. This is a time varying signal. And let's say that it's got some arbitrary frequency content, right? So let's say it looks like an M. This is M of capital M of omega, and it's within this range 20 to 20 kilohertz, or 20, I guess, 20 times 2 pi to 20 times 2 pi kilohertz, right? So it's in that range. And then when we modulate by cosine, as you might recall, multiplication in one domain is convolution in the other domain. So in effect, our modulated signal in the frequency domain is going to be the message signal centered at plus or minus omega c, or the frequency spectrum of our message signal centered at plus or minus omega c. Okay. Now, if we go on, we're going to talk about the AM modulation index, and that is the ratio of the peak of the message signal to the amplitude of the carrier. And distortion is likely to occur when the peak of the message is greater than the amplitude of the carrier, because think about it, our carrier, it's just this ideally oscillating very fast, and in effect, it's going to be sampling whatever our message signal is, right? So let's say we have our message signal in blue here. And if the amplitude of the carrier isn't high enough, the information is going to be lost in the signal. And I'll show you that later in the demonstration. So we're just going to pretend that we have this 900 kilohertz as our carrier because those are licensed by the FCC. And then for a message signal, we're just going to consider a simple 500 hertz cosine pulse. And here's that script. I'm actually going to show you the script on my computer because right now we're on my iPad. Let me download it first so we can play around, make sure that I've got the right file uploaded, because during class today, I did not have the right file uploaded. So I'll just download this. I'm going to share my desktop, okay. And open up the script. All right, so here's that script. I'm going to go ahead and run it so you can see what it does. Give these accesses, okay. So here we have the message signal M of t. It's just the cosine pulse. And then here's our carrier signal. And here's the AM signal. And actually, you'll note that we have two carrier signals here. I've gone ahead and put in 0.5 and 1.5 as our modulation indices. And if you remember, that's the ratio of the peak of the message to the amplitude of the carrier. So you'll see in blue, we have 0.5, which indicates that the amplitude of our carrier is sufficient. And you'll see here, when the amplitude of the carrier is high enough, we are able to retain our information. So information loss occurs right here when the amplitude of the carrier is not sufficient, right? So you can see that the signal begins to distort, or I guess you'd have to also recall that the message is obtained from the envelope of our modulated signal, right? And here, when the amplitude of our carrier is not high enough, we have that distortion. Okay, so let me stop sharing that. And I'll share. And then we can go back to the PDF here. If it'll come up. Yep, there we go. So talked about the script a little bit, and here's the exercise. So we're going to just run the example script and get the 3 plots. You're going to check all of these indices. Also discuss why modulation index greater than unity causes the message signal to distort. And then you're going to do a little bit more exploration on your own end. So we're going to look at this double sideband suppressed carrier signal. And lastly, I just want you to kind of explain what it means for the carrier to be suppressed and what this has to do with power. And yeah, that's pretty much the assignment. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys next time.